And we are live.
We're live. Greetings to our Peacemaker 360 live audience and to all our viewers who will be tuning into this segment from wherever you are around the world today. I'm Adele Kastoun and your host for this 1 hour segment, and I'm calling in live from Sydney, Australia, from the Lounge Down Under. Joining me today live on this Be Live call is the founder of Peacemaker 360 himself, Christian Sito. Kudos to Christian for doing the tech today and also for stepping in to replace our other guest panelists who unfortunately could not make it here today. Joining our guest panelists is Ghada. Ghada is a remarkable youth activist who I had the pleasure of meeting a couple of months ago at the UNAOC, which is the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations, in the US and Europe, where our worlds positively collided. So without further ado, let's head over to Ghada and to Christian for a formal introduction. Ghada and Christian, if you can introduce yourself to our viewers, telling us which countries you're originally from, where you're currently based, and share with us a little bit about your current work and project engagements in the peace building space, and particularly of relevance to our topic today, the role of women in peacemaking and conflict prevention. So let's head over to Ghada.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you, Christian, for the initiative. It's amazing to hear from a lot of people who follow your initiative, and thank you for the opportunity to go live today and to share more about not only the fellowship, but what are we working on. So my name is Ghada Zribi. I come from Tunisia. Like I always say, it's the land of the revolution. I proudly I'm the founder and I lead an organization called I Build Africa. And I'm currently, before telling you more about I Build Africa, I'm going live from Albuquerque, New Mexico. I know it's the other side of the world for professional and academic reasons. So to just give a little bit of overview about I Build Africa, it is a youth-led organization that works to just gather and organize African youth in the continent and the diaspora to work on different thematics that youth themselves define, depending on their needs and priorities, whatever they are. So we work mainly on peace building and engaging women within that process. So we deal with peace as not only the absence of war, but the active engagement of all women and all minority groups of the society to define peace their own way, especially economically talking, and the inclusion of technology to reach peace building and conflict transformation in an innovative way. So I will be very happy to share more about what we do and what are the things that I learned from the fellowship and what did I share with the rest of the participants. But so far, thank you very much again for the invitation.
Thank you, Ghada, for that introduction and for participating with us today. We're really happy and excited to have you here. Let's go over to Christian for an introduction.
All right. Thank you very much, Jessica, again for having us today in the call, and thank you, Ghada, for accepting the invitation. It's really an exciting moment for me to have this conversation with all of us, and thanks again for all our online viewers who are tuning in from different parts of the world to share their thoughts as well on what is going to be a very exciting conversation. So my name is Christian Chito Chirigiri. I'm from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm the founder of Peacemaker 360, which is an online platform that connects young peace builders from around the world. We started this platform in 2016, just from the desire to find stories of different youth working in contexts around the world that are affected by conflicts that often do not have a space to share their stories. I'm calling you today from Brussels in Belgium, where I'm actually doing my PhD in law and criminology and doing my research on transitional justice and victim participation in transitional justice. So this is really great, and looking forward to this conversation and can't wait to learn more from Ghada and from our online viewers as well.
Great. Thank you for introducing yourself, Christian, to our viewers. And it looks like we have both of you, one from Brussels and the other one from New Mexico. So I'm quite surprised that we were able to get the times together. So that's great. What's going to happen in this segment is that we'll be exploring the topic of the role of women in peacemaking and conflict prevention, which is sort of a sequel to one of the topics that we did on FGM, which our live audience really enjoyed. And it's sort of under the umbrella of protecting women's rights and empowering women. Today, we will leverage our panelists' insights and professional work with women, as well as their reflections on the UNAOC Fellowship Program, and in Ghada's case, the alumni as well, so that our audience has a greater appreciation of the UNAOC Fellowship, should they choose to apply for it in 2020. So I'm going to start by briefly setting the substantive scene underpinning our discussion, and then we will head over to our panelists for their reflections. During our discussion, we will check in with Christian to hear from our audience to see if you have any questions for our panelists. So get comfortable, get these notepads out and your phones, and get ready and start texting your questions away. So what's the international legal framework behind our topic? Well, in the year 2000, the United Nations Security Council introduced Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. That declaration declared the significance of women's participation in conflict resolution and political processes, and in post-conflict reconstruction, by essentially emphasizing the disproportionate and severe impacts armed conflict has on women and young girls. Resolution 1325 is predicated on 3 central pillars, which is prevention, participation, and protection. And it has been supplemented by, I think, 7 further resolutions to date. For our purposes today, Resolution 1820, which came about in 2008, is relevant as it distinguishes the concerns of women and girls within crisis and conflict areas as a distinct vulnerable category of becoming victims of extensive and systematic sexual violence, including within the context of displacement. UN Security Council Resolution 1820 advocates for an understanding of sexual violence and other forms of gender-specific violence as part of a wider spectrum of violence and being a fundamental attack on the human rights of women and girls. This resolution acknowledges that the elimination of all forms of violence in both the public and the private spheres requires a gender-sensitive prevention approach for the greater protection and security of women and girls. Further complementary measures to combat SGBV, which is sexual gender-based violence, or GB, gender-based violence, and improve the protection of women and girls are declared in Resolution 1960. That one came about in 2010. Resolution 1960 addresses impunity by providing mechanisms to bring perpetrators to justice. It basically introduces a system for criminal prosecution of war crimes and violent crimes and provides comprehensive support and remedies for survivors of violence through psychological, legal, medical, and economic measures. Okay, so with that backdrop in mind, let's head over to our guest speakers to explore their views on this subject matter. So, Christian and Ghada, from your experiences, or rather from the UNAOC Fellowship or alumni, how would you describe implementation of Resolution 1325, so its framework, by referencing your country of origins or the MENA or the US, Germany or Spain? Can you basically talk us through any gaps that you perceived within the policy cycle? So say from the delivery of funding to policy implementation.
I will go first. So from my experience coming from Tunisia and meeting people coming from the MENA region, the fellowship has been truly eye-opening because going to different institutions, whether governmental or non-governmental, in New York City, Washington, D.C., Madrid, and Berlin has been truly interesting because we just got to know that Thankfully, we're not starting from scratch. We're all working under the umbrella of 1325. So, of course, with different organizations come different resources, different priorities, and different understanding, of course. So something that we noticed that we all share, whether the fellows or the grassroots organizations we visited, is that we got to understand that we need to deal with the implementation and the understanding of the resolution differently. We need to not only decomplex the wording and the languages around this resolution to reach the aspired objectives, and we needed also to just grow the outreach and to make people feel more involved, not as numbers, because for years now, people have perceived whatever the civil society or governments are doing in this topic as a numbers game. So the thing that we were all agreeing on is that we need to advocate or even practice, not preach, for a meaningful participation that contributes not only to gender targets or the things that we're going to discuss further on, but also to the whole resolution. And we noticed that gaps differ from a place to the other and from the a reality to the other. For example, civil society in where I come from, Tunisia, or the MENA region in general, everyone agreed that we do notice a gap in funding, for example, and also the problem of data collection, that we don't have enough data to assess on what's really happening on the ground. So that's something else that I remember we discussed. So that's pretty much very briefly the gaps that we notice, especially the responsibility that people are feeling now, because more and more youth, especially in every society, are just growing very apart, losing faith from their governments, which can be indeed dangerous. And this is what we discussed in the alumni meeting in New York City when we were talking that it is high time we engaged everyone in this conversation and we make it more accessible for everyone, so that we do not give the floor for subgroup or sub-identities that use this lack of faith or lack of confidence in the governments to organize youth and use them in their own extremist purposes. So this is pretty much what we were discussing.
Thank you for sharing, Ghada. And Christian, over to you.
Yeah, if I may just pick up from what Radha just shared, it's really fascinating to hear how in the MENA region that youth are pushing their government leaders to not abide with some of these extremist ideas that may be dividing communities. I want to speak at least from my Congolese context, but as well from my Colombian context, which I've been working in the past 3 years. And one thing that is at least a common trend that we see both in Colombia and Congo is that due to the very pervasive nature of conflict that has been going on for a long time, women have tended to be not only excluded from the peace building processes, but have also been given very marginal places in terms of participation. And too often these spaces tend to be contested by different groups of organizations that are maybe more powerful. And one thing that I feel like is also probably a very interesting point that I'd like to make as well in connection to what Radha shared, when you talk about gender participation, at least in the Colombian context, we see not only that we talk about gender, but we also need to make a very specific analysis of what kind of women are also participating. There's such a big gap between rural and urban women in the Colombian context. There's a big difference between educated and uneducated women. And too often we see that if you're coming from a rural background or you are less educated, or you are less connected to the peace building system, your space for participation is very marginal. And this is the same as well in the Congolese context, where due to the fact that conflict has divided not only the urban and the rural settings, we see as well the gap in terms of infrastructure. Most women do not just have the means to afford to go to some of these places that are located far away from their homes to participate in peace building mechanisms. And I feel like these are some of very practical realities that most women face. And I feel it's very important as we talk about women's participation in conflict prevention and peace building, we start looking at what are the things, what are the stumbling blocks that make it quite impossible in many contexts. And I feel like this vary from one region to another. I also want to say hi to all our online viewers. I can see some people already commenting from Colombia. We see Manuel, we see James from the United States. Thank you for joining. We see Francine from the UK. Who's also a very staunch activist. Thank you all for joining the conversation, and we also want to learn from you as well.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing, Christian. And I'll reiterate, welcome to all our audience, and hopefully we'll tune in soon with your questions. So I'll just repeat back what you identified as the gaps with 1325 from Ghada's, and looking at the Middle East context or broadly. Ghada mentioned the importance of trying to deconstruct the language of the resolution 1325, and the importance of looking at the outreach of the funding, and not just looking at it in terms of it being a numbers game, which it looks like to date it has been the focus on gender targeting and numbers. That Ghada also mentioned the importance of collecting that data in order to understand and analyze what exactly are the gaps in the field, and also allowing and enabling the youth to have a voice, especially the youth in the MENA, to have a voice on that. And from Christians, and in the Congolese context, Christian reiterated how unfortunately women are still excluded in that context, specifically within the rural areas and the more marginalized areas. So Christian reiterated the importance of enabling women from each age group or region to participate in Resolution 1325, and also factoring into account the practical realities of how to do that. So both of you shared really important points which sort of go into question 2, which I had laid out. And if we can hear your take on that, can you also share with the audience some of your key recommendations and action plans to tackle violence against women and girls more broadly? Ghada, you can rely on what you submitted for the UN, UNAOC during the fellowship, and Christian, anything more broadly. Over to you, Ghada.
Yeah, thank you. So in the UNAOC, in the alumni reunion, and we had such amazing insights from everyone. And the group that I worked with, it had Anas, it had a lot of people and a lot of young activists who are doing an amazing job. And we all came up with 4 straight to the point recommendations that we put in our presentation in order to advance the role of youth specifically in giving the platform to women to be as active peacemakers and contributors to the conflict transformation in the world. So the first point that we tackled was funding, of course, because we cannot, whether we like it or not, people need money to invest their time and effort to contribute to this global vision we have. And unfortunately, not everyone is privileged enough to do that if not supported by the necessary funding. So the first recommendation tackling funding was to provide unrestricted funding opportunities for youth-led and youth-focused peace-building organizations. So here we highlighted the unrestricted funding opportunities because it is something that us people who work in civil society know that submitting grant proposals or approaching potential donors to support our initiatives is growing more and more restricted and hard to reach, because unfortunately that's another gap that we witness in our I will talk about the MENA region, that now funds are being given to specific people who will say the buzzwords, or who will contribute to the general vision that donors want to put on their annual reports. So this is something else that we wanted to tackle, that everyone who is doing an effort in their own community needs to be recognized and needs to be supported, no matter what the scale is, because it remains an important effort. And the second part was the political participation. So we recommended engaging women to participate in decision-making processes by implementing binding national commitments on meaningful participation, and why not quotas for having women meaningfully participating, not only having a seat on the table, but also being handed the mic to localize or locate their own priorities and just deliver their own narratives without having someone going in there on their behalfs and speaking in their name. The third point was regarding inequality. So that point tackled taking all such necessary steps and measures to close any gender gaps and abolish discriminatory laws that affect women, which pertain to their access and participation in the labor market. So here we need to think about the different parts of the world, because as women, our priorities differ. Here, maybe in the US, there is a huge debate about the equal wage gap, but in Tunisia, in North Africa, or in Africa, you will find different priorities for women to even enter the job market. So this is something else that we wanted to discuss. And finally, we were talking about, when it comes to project design, we recommended that peace and conflict prevention strategies should recognize and adopt community-based approaches to peace building, because that's exactly where change making starts. It's not on the global or the national level. It starts from the community, from the family, from a friend-to-friend relationship. That's where we need to think about how can we best support communities to grow more confident, even talking about peace in general, because there's a huge gap in even understanding how someone can build peace in their own small community.
Yeah, I also actually want to pick up from there.
Thank you for your insights, Ghada.
Yes, sorry for the time.
Go ahead.
But I just wanted to mention that I actually agreed with all the points that Rada shared in terms of some of the discrepancies that are on the ground in terms for women participation. I think finances and access to finances is a big one. Representation still seems to be tokenistic to a large extent. And she also pointed to the fact that when it comes to employment opportunities, women tend to be given less chances, and especially, again, connecting to the point I mentioned earlier, the further remotely you are to the positions of power or to places where this decision making are taking place, it's really hard to be able to access opportunities. One of the key other points that I also think is very important to bring in the conversation is the overlap that there is between Resolution 1325 and also Resolution 2250. To a large extent, it's not just been women who have been marginalized or excluded, but also being the youth as well. And these two resolutions, to me, need to be actually brought in conversations between each other. Of course, Resolution 1325 is the oldest, and there's definitely a lot of lessons learned and best practices that can be drawn from that. But I also think it's high time that the advances and the milestones that have been achieved to a large extent by Resolution 1325 be brought into the implementation as well of Resolution 2250, and more specifically relating to the point that Ghada has mentioned earlier on when it comes to finances. While of course many projects of women tend to still lack finances to advance, I still think there's been a lot of milestone that has been achieved over the past few years to make sure that women's rights are given a sense of urgency. And most recently, of course, with all the movement that we've seen around the world rising to defend, women participation in the working space, to talk about issues of sexual violence in the working space. I feel like these issues have brought to more attention and more attraction of finances that could also be a lesson to learn from for youth organizations. I'm just trying to point to the fact that there's this conversation that needs to go also in that direction, so that youth who are young people around the world, women as well, can also see how to use Resolution 2250 for the advancement of women participation.
Definitely. Thank you for highlighting the importance of really factoring in Resolution 2250 together with 1325. Christian, while we have you there, do we have any questions directly from our audience to either of you?
All right. So far, we don't have any question, but we actually have a contributor from the UK, Francine Mukwaya, who says, my argument to close the gender gap is to start from young age and educate our young boys and girls from our respective communities, because education from such an age is so important to help close the gender gap. But we also have friends from Cameroon who are joining, and from different parts of the world who are really excited by the conversation. So it's good to say that.
That's great. I didn't quite catch the name of the participant. What was her name?
Her name is Francine Mukwaya. And we just received also, yes, Francine Mukwaya.
Francine, thank you for that. Francine, your question actually leads in with one of the ones that I prepared here. So, how can we essentially empower women and girls survivors of violence and conflict to build a more hopeful future and a more positive narrative? Is there a role for education that fits at all here, as Francine pointed, or is there anything else you can help us consider at this stage?
Do you want to go first, or?
I may actually jump in first, actually. In terms of how can we continue building on the milestone of Resolution 1325 and what can be done to advance it, if I caught the question correctly. I think I want to share just 3 reflections. And the first one that I think is so important here is what Francine has shared. Education is key, but again, education has to be also contextualized. It's not necessarily the Western education, but education that the people really, from each context, consider to connect deeply with their values of dignity, of respect, of tolerance, of empathy and understanding. And I feel like that kind of education is not so often talked about. It's often tends to be education from what we see and hear in normative practices or from the West. And I think that's something to deconstruct and to demystify. The second point I also want to add, it's not just education, but in Congo and in the Colombian context, at least from where I've been working over the past few years, I think there's need to open up more space in terms of participation and engagement with different stakeholders. Women are not just, or young peace builders and women in general are not just affected by the fact that their communities tend to be often reluctant to hear their voices, but they're also, as Ghada has pointed out, taken up a little bit of a prey in a very oppressive public space. And I think that's really something you need to bring up, that the conversation has to go in all directions with public servants, with business actors and so on and so forth, because all of them actually interact with women in one or the other. And the last point I also want to mention here, and I think this is very important, especially as we talk about leadership, and I think this is key. Women, for them to be able to empower other women and to make really great strides, they need to be leading these movements. And I feel so often uncomfortable, and this is something I want to say as a man, that while I'm happy to be part of the conversation, I think this space should be taken by women as well, that the conversation needs to also really engage as many women to talk about the differences, the challenges, and to allow different voices to be heard as well.
I would build on that point. But before starting, I would share a small anecdote that we had in I Build Africa. We had a workshop where we invited young high school students. They were all females. And we were discussing the word empowerment. And it was very interesting because the word even is a bit... So the question of one of the participants was, if we're going to say empowerment, then who really holds the power? And in that way, we were discussing, why are we using empowerment, even if it's from a woman to a woman? Are we given the patronizing perspective of, I'm more privileged than you, so I'm giving you the power and you need to be thankful for it? So that's the first thing that I wanted to just share. I'm trying and I'm sharing with more people that maybe we need to also pay attention to the language that we use when talking about such topics. If terms are being questioned, that we need to have more debates about such terms, even if it's officially used in documents and in resolutions. I feel that empowerment is a term that needs to be revisited. And going back to the topic, I agree that education is extremely important, and it is the foundation of any community and of raising powerful generation of young girls and women. And I remember, Jessica, when we went to visit, when we received the founder of 180 Degrees Network in Germany, he shared that they had 64% of multipliers of their projects in their own communities. And just FYI that 180 Degrees, they work on women and PVE. But they also shared an important point that I remember. He said that women were their early warning system to report about violence cases or extremism cases in neighborhoods. So I find that very important. When we provide the necessary tools and training for women to understand that this is something they need to think about or they need to report, then we will end up with a whole generation of young girls and women who know exactly how to react and how to multiply the positive effect in their own community. Another thing that we were tackling was the victimization of women. And if Anas was here, he would have said it, because it is a point that we kept talking about. It is high time that we stopped putting women in the position of victims, because women are also perpetrators of violence. So women are powerful, and it is the time that we talk about how to go back to the objective of ending violence, not to teaching women how to cope with violence in their own communities. So that is something else that we need to think about when talking about quality education, because also in communities that are well educated, like Germany or the US or Madrid, we have been told that there is an important percentage of women who joined extremist groups, and they were educated, but they were in a position of void, of even boredom. I remember I was doing a research about why women actually join extremist groups. It was because of a partner, but it was also because of conviction. So it is something else that we need to think about when talking about education and the role of education, to just make women think more about gender-based violence.
Great. Thank you for sharing, Ghada. Those are very important and powerful points. And I do clearly remember, and I make a mention to Anas. I wish you could join us today on the call, but unfortunately you couldn't for some reason. But I clearly remember that you and Anas had a bit of an issue with the word empowering women and how it's phrased. From my perspective, I do see why the wording of empowering women is placed from a policy perspective, especially if you're looking at the Women, Peace and Security portfolio broadly, because it sort of encapsulates every aspect of the policy without breaking it down into details or without deconstructing it. But I suppose this is one of the things that when you're looking at a particular country, that's where it is important to break down what essentially do you mean by empowerment of women. So it's my understanding, and from being in Australia, it's more supposed to have that positive outlook. Having said that, the two other wordings, when we look at survivors of GBV, essentially women who've experienced violence, usually the wording is victims or survivors. So in my personal view, and that's just my personal view, I see scrapping the word victim and just looking at that woman as a survivor of GBV or survivor of SGBV. And I think that's more of an empowering narrative. That's just my perspective on it. So what are some of the future conflict resolution strategies that you both believe that we can apply and consider incorporating to ensure the meaningful participation of women who have experienced GBV or SGBV? So future-wise.
I remember I was in a meeting and a very important insight was shared with me is that the security of women is one of the most reliable indicators of peacefulness in any state or any country. So I would say security is number one priority, because if we're asking women to report anything wrong in the society or cooperate with civil society to just make an unusual change in the society, then we need to ensure that they are protected and that their security is well kept in mind, not only the physical, but also the mental security of women, because that's extremely important. Like we said before, there's always the point of the meaningful participation. There's also the economic empowerment of women by providing more opportunities and equal access to those opportunities for women to any field that they find best in their own community, and encouraging them to innovate and join more STEM fields, especially for young girls. So I would just summarize everything by saying that we just need more access to opportunities for women and security as well.
I actually want to pick up from that
point. Thank you, Ghada.
Yeah, from Ghada. I think the fact that I'm sitting in Brussels and Jessica's calling from Sydney, we actually have that time difference, so even the internet is not working well. But I was just going to pick up from what Ghada shared about protection. I think this is such a very urgent and important point, especially in a context where the civic space is increasingly shrinking. And we see this actually a report that was published just early this month, I think, by Frontline Human Rights, which talks about how in country contexts like Colombia, the Philippines, human rights have actually been targeted and killed, and the rates are really very shocking. And I think it's not just in the human rights sector, but we see this attack and the need for protection also going towards women, and feminicides have increased in Honduras, in Mexico. We've heard a lot of stories where women who are standing for the rights of their community, was working for peace, are mostly targeted. So I think that's quite important. But I also want to add another point that I think is also important to consider, and this has to do with the generational mindset shift that needs to happen. We are still working in a context that is highly dominated by people from the older generation who might still hold values and beliefs and stereotypes that do not align with liberal thinking that all of us embody, even espouse in this conversation. And I think this is really one of the biggest challenges that we face in the fight towards promotion of women's rights, towards promoting women leadership in the peace building system, but more importantly as well, to creating and opening up a space for young people who want to change the system or who want to improve the conditions of life in their communities to be heard. And this is why I think we need to think more critically. How do we change mindsets that are sometimes very conservative and sometimes simply oppressive to women leadership and women position of power.
Yeah, I would add on that that we're witnessing a new term of young at heart, and here it's a bit. I don't know how to feel about young at heart because it's very rare to find high scale platforms where you find young people as real decision makers. So I would totally endorse what Christian has said. And here, by saying this, we're not actually like enforcing an exclusion on the previous generations, but we just are advocating for more spaces for us because we are tired from being called the generation of the future. We are the generation of the present. And in order to prepare the generation of the future, we need to give the platform for people who are living in the now, and with keeping all of the respect and all of the gratitude to the generation that were before us, because we stand on their shoulders of the different campaigns and the different efforts that they have done so that we reach today, being the people that we are, being the loud women that we are, which is great. And I'm so thankful that we reached this point, but it's not enough because all of the objectives that we have set years ago are not met. So it is about time to just give young people the floor, but also the full decision.
Ghada, if you remember when we were sitting with the High Representative in the room and he was basically talking about how you are the new generation, you are the future leaders, and how the most important task for us is to work on our mindset, and then keep fighting against the negativity from the elder generation. So he said it really well, and that's something that resonated for me. We always hear the negativity from the elder generation. There's no judgment about that, but a lot of the work that we need to do as women peace leaders and men peace builders is to focus on our mindset and how we're going to approach this context one day at a time. So that was really great. And the importance of security, which Ghada mentioned as well, which is obviously the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if we cannot fulfill that for women, if women can't feel secure in themselves, how can we even reach that level of self-actualization, which is the top of empowering women? So this has been a great discussion. I think it will be good now to head over to our audience to see if they have any question for our panelists. Christian, can you see anything from the audience there?
Yeah, we've actually been having a very vibrant audience today, and there's been a lot of comments. Thank you for all our online viewers who are participating. I want to just read a few comments here. One which has been shared by Christelle Bay from Cameroon, and she basically comments on Resolution 1325 and poses two questions. The first thing she says is, UNSCR turns 20 this year. When it comes to women, peace and security, I'll be suggesting the following. And one thing she says is, how has UN Security Council Resolution 1325 been translated when it comes to the representation of women's role and agency? To her, the concept needs to translate to meet local realities in various contexts, especially around women's participation or representation in peace building. And how is participation represented? It is just in terms of numbers or the quality of this representation. So she's bringing that tension there. Are we just talking about participation in terms of numbers, which Ghada has mentioned earlier, or really in terms of the quality of representation? And these need to be addressed as well in 1325. Thank you very much again, Christelle, for that comment. I don't know if there is any reaction directly to that, Jessica.
Yeah, thank you, Christian Bates from Cameroon, for that comment about the role of women's agency and looking at that. Ghada, did you have any commentary on that?
I agree. I agree. She said it all. I think if we something that I keep repeating, if we just implement all of the resolutions and all of the promises that we have, we will be just fine. If everyone will stick to the milestones that we put without actually overcomplicating it for everyone to actually take the real simple efforts and activities, then we're fine. The world will be fine. And I hope that by 2030 we won't have to talk about this and repeat it again and again. So I'm hopeful of the future, but I also do emphasize every time that we should not give up, because we came such a long way from having nothing to today. So yeah, thank you for all of the comments of the people on live.
Yeah, and actually Christelle actually commented and continued on the same train, and she said there needs to be recognition of important roles that grassroots women play in peace building processes, using traditional methods to lead conflict mediation resolution, the documentation, building their reporting skills and strengthening their income generating skills. All this needs to be highlighted and also be, visibilized. Maybe one last comment that actually I can read from Francine Mukwaya, who is also joining us from London. And she says, what is then the way forward in terms of peace and the resolution worldwide? Because if you're talking about 20 years of the resolution this year, then globally, what is the real way forward that brings all of these points we're talking about together?
If I can just...
Yeah, that's definitely a very good question. And I think, yes, Ghada, you can...
No, I was just going to just go back to the recommendation that the 4 very brief point that we discussed earlier. If everyone just agrees that we need to think about those rationally and work towards achieving those very clear goals, then we can reach a very prominent position in the future. I'll leave it to you, Jessica.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to share briefly one of the strategies that we've spoken about earlier, and we just mentioned it, was conflict resolution, so mediation at the grassroots. The importance of these soft skills, I can't even underscore how important it is at a grassroots community level, just applying these different types of mediation, whether that's in the family setting, whether that's at the community level. These, I think, the soft skills are sometimes taken for granted, or not. Well, in a sense, we look at, women's participation in mediation at a political level, and we tend to forget the role of women within the private space, within the family or within the community, rather than at large. So I believe Christian or Francine raised that point as well. Thanks for reminding us of that. Christian, did you have any other points you'd like to share or comment about?
I actually don't have any other point to add, and just want to say thanks to all our online viewers, and thanks to you, Jessica, and thanks, Ghada, for just bringing so much energy and passion in this conversation and for sharing your work. This has been just a fabulous, fabulous conversation, and I really hope we can continue it and actually move to action, because that's really what matters at the end of the day.
Thank you very much.
Ghada, any final words from your end?
I would just invite everyone to go check our website, ibuildafrica.net, and I would invite everyone to just dare to take any action. Do not let anyone minimizes your effort. You're doing a good job, and I really hope that we will also have a conversation about mental health for people who are doing efforts in their own community, because that's another conversation that we forget when talking about women in conflict, especially. So I would thank you very much for this space, and I'm truly looking forward to listening to more broadcasts from your initiative.
Thank you, Ghada, and I think we will share with our viewers your link under the YouTube when we post it, so they can see I Build Africa and visit your website. It's been a pleasure having you here and connecting with you again, and thank you to all of our live audience and to our viewers for tuning into this call again. And I think with that, we've reached our time cap. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening at your end of the world.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Bye, Christian.
Bye-bye, Jessica.
Bye.